Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle and welcome to Walsingham, where we're in our studio right in the heart of this wonderful shrine village. And with me is Christine Mugridge. Christine, it's terrific to see you. And wasn't it amazing we met here in Walsingham, having last been together in Rome? Gosh, with Pope John Paul, beloved John Paul, remember?
Yes, absolutely. It's wonderful to see you.
Isn't it wonderful? Now, when we were together then, that's a way back, it was with a group of women, which you'd initiated, to talk about the role of women in the church and to celebrate what it was to be Catholic women. Now, who else was there in that group?
Oh, we had women from all different countries. We had them represented from the United States. Kimberly Hahn was there. We had several different people from Portugal as well, and many women from Europe.
And I remember it was a sort of EWTN thing. Rhoda Sherwin was there.
Rhonda Sherwin was there.
That's it,
yes.
Rhonda.
Yes.
And you presented the Holy Father with our book. And then that was reprinted. I remember getting a second edition of that book. It was rather exciting.
Yes.
So tell us a bit about that book first, and then we'll recap on what you're doing now.
Well, the book was inspired, as you know, from the writings of Pope John Paul. He wrote on the gift of femininity and the understanding of the mutual complementarity of men and women. And what I had seen actually were a lot of books that were argumentative and argue-based. And I thought, no, I know a lot of women in the Catholic Church who are doing wonderful things. They're very close to the Holy Father. They love the faith. And I wanted to showcase some of those women doing these beautiful, exciting things in the church. And so I contacted about 12 women from 10 different countries, said, I want you to do something a little bit unusual. I want you to write about what you are doing. Most of them don't write about themselves, but I wanted them to brag a little bit. And most importantly, I wanted them to talk about the opportunities that being a Catholic woman had opened up for them.
That's what I remember, the positive thing, because at that time, and still to some extent, people are very militantly anti-feminist, but that doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't answer the questions that women outside the church have and the prejudices they have about Catholicism, but also to some extent some of the legitimate questions, and then the wrong answers, that some of the feminists have, because they're often asking quite useful questions.
Yes.
Why are there differences? Are there differences with men? Is it significant? But then they come up with completely crazy answers. But we took note of the questions, and I really loved that. I found it very creative and positive.
John Paul had a wonderful sense of what we call Christian anthropology, to understand the meaning of human nature and the differences between male and female. And it wasn't put into what we would call gender studies. It was more holistic and integrated into the approach of human being. But nonetheless, I felt it was very important that we say thank you to him, because he had done many wonderful works with particular women. For example, Joanna Bogle, who is the foundress of Folklore. She contributed a chapter, and what I had wanted to show was that John Paul himself actually gave land and opened up the potential for Folklore to exist in the church.
Wow.
And John Paul said, unless women receive, and these are his words, money, land, and titles from within the church, the true face of human being will not reflect in the church. Now, I didn't say that. I didn't ask him to say that either. This just happened to be his opinion. So Joanna Bogle, for example, was given grounds on Castel Gandolfo.
I'm fascinated by this because in the 20th century in particular, women, because there were 2 world wars and all of that, were in such a very different position from the way they'd been in the 19th. And the church took a little while to wake up to that. She always does. That's in the nature of the church. There's a wisdom sometimes in moving slowly. But John Paul, as a young man, had acted with women, literally acted with them in drama, and in the extraordinary circumstances of occupied Poland, had a more warm, friendly, easy relationship than perhaps he might have done in a traditional seminary. So history was ready for this man as he became priest, bishop, and pope, wasn't he?
Yes, and while we were in Rome, in fact, I was actually studying for my doctoral degree within the Pontifical University system. Now, I hadn't realized this, but it was Pope John Paul II who requested that the pontifical universities open up not only to laity being educated, but also to women, which, you know, in some ways, I think there is something to be said for an all-male education environment and an all-female education environment, because we do learn differently, we approach things differently. But under the pontiff of John Paul II, they wanted to have the opportunity for laity to study alongside the seminarians. So what was a novelty when I was there now is the norm. You see students studying shoulder to shoulder, and some of them are going to be ordained, and some of them are meeting and going to be married, and some that are ordained will officiate at the wedding of their peers who studied together. It's a beautiful new world.
It is.
Yes.
And I can't help thinking that this is something that was prophetically coming in the right way, because it's always movements like this in the church, not committees and councils really, that do things, and this understanding of the lay role in teamship with priests.
Yes.
Very attractive, very attractive. And then working together and the intellectually grounding stuff of that.
And it calms you down in this way. We don't have to all be ordained to be able to express the gifts that God has given us to serve the church. And when you study shoulder to shoulder, the priests themselves, the deacons and the seminarians, they form lifelong friendships and bonds with people who will support them, so that they're not on their own, isolated, without family and friends for their priestly ministry.
And then we're back to John Paul. That was how he saw things, wasn't it? That he learned from women and wrote beautifully about that.
He did. He also wrote on what we refer to as the theology of the body, which is a compendium of Wednesday audiences that he gave over several years about the nature and the complementarity of male and female being created in the image and likeness of God. Now, some studies and promotions of the theology of the body may focus on the sexuality aspect, but that is only taking a small part of it. The fact is, we need to understand a Christian anthropological view of what it means to be human. And John Paul II saw that, in fact, prophetically, Joanna, if you can imagine, because of the issues and the questions we have today. He knew we needed to be strengthened in our understanding that it is in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, that we are made.
I thought this because when I first came across the theology of the body, I thought this was incredibly rich, and I came a bit late to it, and we were just beginning to get this transgender stuff and everything a few years ago, the beginnings of it. And I thought, wow, this is what John Paul was talking about. And then I found a lot of people, including, you know, really good people, were busy with their booklets and pamphlets, all assuming it was simply a repackage of how to live in a chaste way. Well, that's not the point at all. And although it's often some of the stuff they use is very good, it's useful. But and I thought, did I get it wrong? Have I got a sort of richly prophetic insight nobody else has had? And then it dawned on me, I don't think so. I think it was just that John Paul was. And now, in an almost funny, I mean comic way, he's so prophetic. So we're now having this absurd nonsense where I, as a journalist, I'm told, you know, I have to be careful of not using language which is sex-specific to men and women, and this kind of rubbish. And some of it is, well, downright sinister, because in Britain, with our glorious tradition of freedom, you know, hard won, we're now having this appalling self-censorship, like writers did in Russia in the 60s and 70s, where they produced things for sort of samizdat, because, well, it's nonsense. But I felt our days in Rome were part of a positive response to that, which, do you feel this, has not yet been fully taken up by the church. A lot of people are still stuck with not really knowing how to answer some of the feminists, and even more, how to answer this transgender stuff.
Well, I think this is why the writings of John Paul will have an impact for the next century, because they are deeply rich and very informative and prophetic. there is a lot of material to discover. But in our era specifically, we seem to be going through an identity crisis. What does it mean to be human? Is there such a thing as being created male and female, or are there a multiplicity of ways that God created us? So I like to encourage people to start from the original intention of God as revealed in the doctrine of our faith and expressed in the pastoral life of the sacraments. And I like to say, if we move in the wound that we are living versus moving in Christ, who reveals the fullness of what it means to be a human being, if we move in the wound, we're going to get lost, because you're always then band-aiding the band-aid and band-aiding the band-aid. Yes. And wherever you see, like for example, the linguistic restrictions that you're speaking of right now, wherever you see that, that bespeaks of a lack of freedom. And a lack of freedom is not what God came to give us. Truly, when you study the faith and you see the doctrine, and in fact the writings, for example, of John Paul now on women and on the theology of the body, you can take them in small segments. You don't have to be daunted by this huge, giant work of brilliant writing. When we approach the faith and assimilate small elements of it, they elevate our understanding of human nature and human being. And far from restricting, they create a freedom. And it's a lovely freedom.
It's a lovely freedom, and it's to do with truth.
Yes.
I think there is this idea that the church, and this is something that John Henry Newman was particularly emphatic about, bravo, he understood it's all about truth, and it's not about power, it's about truth.
Yes.
And the church herself, and that's important too, for she is a mother, and there's a very rich male-female thing going on, Christ and his bride, God and Israel, this is deep stuff.
Yes.
She is about truth, teaching her children the truth. The interesting thing is, this is something John Paul understood too, we're living in an era when we can, if we find the right delicate language, speak with a greater degree of frankness about the differences between men and women. We are different in every part of our body, including the unexplored bit up here, the brain. And I think the Victorians gave us a slightly overly prudish thing, and I don't need to say that modern life often gives us incredible crudity, but somewhere in the middle that John Paul managed to speak in a delicate but very clear way about sexual difference.
Well, my desire, first of all, to put the collection together of women's testimonies, if you will, was to simply present to John Paul a living bouquet, the fruit of his pontificate, of symbols and signs and living testimony of what is actually working. These were women that have wonderful outreach and tremendous capacities that he also saw, and they knew him personally. And you were a part of this because of the beautiful outreach and your energy and your impact here in England and in Europe. My desire was to simply say, Holy Father, this is a bouquet of living testimonies for you to just be refreshed in, to just have a moment where we can say thank you and we love you as a human being, and recognize that he did many good things, and he wrote such a plethora of material for us in which we can spend, as I said, unpacking for the next 100 years. I want to make a comment you mentioned about anger and feminism. When I wrote this book and put together the introduction, I had an idea of the gift of femininity, which is from the garden. Adam was presented with the gift of femininity, and when he accepted the gift of the presence of the woman who was very different from him, nonetheless at that moment he understood his own masculine identity. It was in the acceptance of the feminine present as a gift that his masculine identity was in fact revealed to himself most completely. So the idea, first of all, is we are existing as a gift for the other.
That's fabulous, isn't it?
So when I studied this and applied it in a pastoral sense, I wasn't looking at an ism, because an ism is a movement in a temporal realm. I was looking more in the nature of gift, The Gift of Femininity was the original title of the book for that very reason. And if God created women as a gift for male to receive at that moment, also John Paul is saying God has created women as a gift for the church.
Isn't that fabulous? I think we missed out on a lot of this because too often we Catholics, I'm using them in very general terms now, especially in the West, are media driven. We take the agenda from people who do not understand but are opposed to what they see as the teaching of the church. And we start from there, in that wound.
Right, in the wound.
Rather than from where we could and should be starting in a much richer perspective. And
from the gift.
I think that's very important.
So I want to mention something. The issue again of anger and feminism. I love the feminists. And I'm sorry that they're angry, but I want to engage them in conversation because I feel that the perspective and the place that they stand is one of great limitations on them because they're moving in an anger which says something that I have a right to has been taken from me and I want it back. And that grasping is getting in the way, in my understanding of it, of them actually just stepping into their God-given dignity and role and right. And John Paul explained it like this. In the role of women and men, women have a natural innate receptivity. Why be upset about that? It's been abused. Okay, if it has been abused, that's another issue. But let's celebrate, first of all, the ontological reality of the receptive nature of women. Okay, so let's start from the gift. If I have a receptive nature, John Paul II says, it is also so that God can speak to us very deeply. He said women are created in such a way that God speaks to them deeply. Men are created in such a way where they would be better if they heard from the woman about God.
Isn't this deep stuff?
Isn't that lovely?
I'm wondering if it doesn't take us back almost to Genesis, where the original sin is essentially all about taking what was really offered as a gift, stealing what God had planned to give in the first place as a gift, the whole of the beauty of the thing, the whole of the beauty of creation, but stealing it instead of receiving it as a gift, which he wanted to give.
Yes.
I think there's a great wisdom in this too, because women do nurture the faith, they do teach, and I remember once somebody saying, oh, well, you know, the Catholic Church male-dominated, and I had a sudden understanding in a very ordinary sort of way. Most of us learned about God in a woman's voice. It was mostly our mother. It was often a woman, mother, grandmother, primary school teacher, who answered those really big questions you have, like, where did Grandpa go when he died?
Yes.
And did God mind when the guinea pig died? Sort of, this is deep stuff. And I can remember as a little girl, I wasn't troubled by death. I was an inquisitive child, but ours was a happy home. But I had lots of questions, and they were mostly answered to me by my mother.
Yes.
And we had really quite profound discussions. And it was also, well, it happened to me, but I think with others too. It was my mother who was first lending me books on religious issues and so on. I got an awful lot from my daddy, but it didn't happen to be discussions about that sort of thing in that way. So women do have this ability to receive, to teach, to share. And down through the centuries, I mean, we've done it.
In extraordinary ways, as a historian, you know, and in my little flights into church history, women within the framework of the Catholic Church were groundbreaking. And they were offering wonderful ministries and missions at a time when women were not allowed to leave the home. They were going out into fields of education and taking care of the sick, creating hospitals and school systems, and doing incredible things. Hildegard von Bingen is one that comes to my mind, studying from a scientific level the nature of healing, also with revelation that was groundbreaking, so much so that the Vatican said, well, we need to assign several cardinals here to really investigate. And then the Church declares her a patroness of Europe, under Pope Benedict XVI, whom many people say was a stodgy conservative and stuffy.
Wasn't.
But he wasn't, because quite frankly, Hildegard von Bingen is about as highly mystical and out there as you can get in the area of giftedness. So why would Pope Benedict put her as a patron of Europe? And especially the feminine elements of all of these things that she uncovered and established, the healing properties of herbs and music.
And I remember the cookery stuff, if one can put it.
Yes.
I'm also wondering whether, in a profound sense, looking at that bigger scope of history, the Church has always understood more and deepened her theology of all sorts of rich things in the study of the great things of God in response to something that began as something wrong. In other words, putting it crudely, she only develops her doctrine in response to a heresy. And I'm wondering whether the feminism that we have known it in the late 20th century, early 21st, and even more, and perhaps also separately, as a separate heresy, this new transgenderism, isn't an authentic heresy, in which case it's rather good news, because in response to it, we develop a richer understanding of male and female.
Yes.
Talking about family, I have to say too, you have one of the most famous surnames to anybody who is interested in recent decades of Catholic history, and that is Mugridge. So you are related to Malcolm Mugridge, the great writer and journalist, and one of the most famous Catholic converts of the latter half of the 20th century. There is a family link there, isn't there?
There is. My parents passed away very early when I was 18. They were in a car accident together. And I had not matured in my faith. I did look at books, though, on their bookshelves after they passed, and there were many books by Malcolm Mugridge. And when I took them down, I read them, and it reminded me of conversations at the dinner table with my mom and my dad. So I took these books, and I went away to college, and there was a convert from the Episcopal faith who had been a married priest in the Episcopalian Church, who was then the first priest to be ordained into the Catholic Church under John Paul II. His name was Father Ray Ryland. And Ray Ryland taught me, when he was Dr. Ryland, in some of his theology classes, and spiritually directed me later when he became Father Ray Ryland. And the first thing that Father Ray said to me was, "Are you related to Malcolm Mugridge?" And I said, "You mean the man whose books line my parents' library shelves?" And I said, "I don't know." So I actually asked a couple of relatives, and they said, "Oh yes," but those relatives were not practicing Catholics. So I wrote to Malcolm, and I got an answer the very day he received my letter. He wrote me back and said, "Yes, we are related, and I will continue to keep you in my prayers." Just a few years after that, he passed away. If I had only had the opportunity, I would have gone to see him immediately. And I'm very grateful for his faith. I'm very grateful for his words of wisdom, because they literally guided me when I lost my parents. They were a voice of sanity and a grounding point of love for the faith and the truth that inspired me. And in fact, I was able to work with Mother Teresa and some of her sisters, and they welcomed me like a family member, but not because of anything I've done. You know, you're born by God's providence to a certain family, and I don't take any claim to that, other than I thank God for him, because he was there for me in a way that gave my life a sense of stability when I definitely needed it.
Isn't that a rather marvelous story? Of course, it was Malcolm Mugridge who told the story of Mother Teresa to the world in this groundbreaking, as they say, epic-making, something beautiful for God.
Yes.
I, of course, remember him on television, and he loved to tell the story later in that particular invincible way with this unforgettable accent about how when they were filming at one point, it was a very dim, dark room, I think in India.
In the House of the Dying in
yes,
Calcutta.
with very inferior lighting and everything,
Yes.
screening out the glare and the noise of the street. And it shouldn't have worked. It shouldn't have worked because of the dim lighting and the inconvenience and the impossibility of getting proper lighting in. And yet, the way he described it, it worked. And the whole of that scene was suffused with light. And of course, he spoke of this in that magnificent way that he did. And I did have the privilege of meeting him. He was very kind to young journalists, and something marvellous about it, something large about his contribution, something generous about the sharing of that in dialogue and discussions, wholly bereft of cant and slushy talk, you know. It was very attractive.
Can we say he is the epitome of every modern man?
Yes.
He went off into this political system, he tried that ideology, he reached the heights of quote-unquote career success, he was intelligent, he was well-traveled, and he was empty.
Yes, I think that's very true.
And when he went to meet Mother Teresa, I think he had to have known there was something more going on for him there than just filming an interesting personage in another country. Because he said to her, almost as if he was challenging her to tell him why he was wrong, he said, "Mother, if I believed like you, when I walked through those doors into a Catholic church, I wouldn't stand. I would get on my knees and go on my knees all the way to the front, where the tabernacle reposes the Lord." And she said something very simple. She said, "Malcolm, you know Jesus here, but you don't know Jesus here."
And then he sort of got it.
At that minute, he said, she simultaneously picked up an infant off the ground, had a cloth, put it on her lap, and wiped the dirty face. And it was in that movement that he saw Jesus. Wow. And it wrecked him.
Final thought here, joyful about the future?
Yes, because the sun rose today and God looked at it and said it is good. Because the minute he says it isn't, we wouldn't even be talking.
So the future is full of hope.
The future is full of hope. Yes, we are Catholic. We have Christ incarnate with us. And I'm not trying to be overly spiritual about it, but I think we need to reacquaint ourselves with the dialogue that happens around the cup of tea in the home, because the home is the first school of love. It is the place where we learn about who we are and how to give and how to be upset and how to hurt and how to be happy. The Catholic home is the place where the transmission of the faith needs to be reinvigorated.
And on that note, here in Walsingham, in England's Nazareth, that's a very good note to end on.
Amen.
Amen.